So when I listen to people like Senator Tommy Tuberville talk about, getting rid of all Muslims in this country, as an African American, I then say, what about white Christians? Because when we look at violence in this country, mass shootings in this country, who typically commits them? That's not true.
Well, that is true.
Okay, if what you just described is the case, then the Italians, the Jewish, the Polish, every group that came to the United States did exactly what you just said. They had own communities, own culture. So, do you understand the history of America?
When Roland Martin steps onto a debate stage, you know someone's argument is about to be thoroughly taken apart. In a fiery exchange on Piers Morgan Uncensored, Jillian Michaels experienced this firsthand. Her initial attempt to push fear-based talking points about Muslim extremism quickly turned into a demonstration of how facts, historical context, and moral clarity can effectively counter rhetoric in real time. But the real kicker here? You need to watch the entire exchange to witness how Roland doesn't just win the argument, he completely redefines what the discussion is about. Before I explain exactly how he achieves this and share my full thoughts on the exchange, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Are you siding with Roland on this one, or do you believe Jillian brought up valid points? Let's dive in.
Let me bring in Roland.
Piers,
you don't have an answer, do you?
Piers, Jillian, I've had to sit here and listen to y'all go back and forth. Can I please make this point?
Please,
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Piers,
Yes.
Last week I was in Montgomery, Alabama for the 7th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. And there is a National Memorial for Peace and Justice and Legacy Museum there that documents, that commemorates the documented 4,400 lynchings in this country. And there were more that took place. As an African American, when I understand what it means when you have a people who have a bullseye on their back, who are being targeted, I understand that. And so it is absolutely shameful that you cannot be at a Hanukkah celebration and it gets interrupted by mass violence because of two evil individuals. But I'm saying two evil individuals for a reason. Because under the legitimate FBI leadership of Christopher Wray, they said that the greatest threat in America is white domestic terrorism. So when I listen to people like Senator Tommy Tuberville talk about, getting rid of all Muslims in this country, as an African American, I then say, what about white Christians? Because when we look at violence in this country, mass shootings in this country, who typically commits them? And so I think anybody has to be very careful to not go down this path of, oh my God, all of them, when I, as an African American, who's also, Jillian, please allow me to finish. When I, as an African American, who's also a Christian, can literally look at the history of white Christians committing violence. And so what we cannot do is say, oh, it is the religion that's driving it, as opposed to it is these evil individuals. Piers, you properly talked about guns and how Australia, after that mass shooting, you said in the 90s, how they targeted. But the fact that they were successful should be a lesson to America. How about you also try that to deal with mass shootings in this country? And so it is wrong for us to go down this path of condemning an entire religion, condemning an entire group of people, whether they are Muslim, whether they are Jewish, whether they are Christian. What we have to recognize is there are evil people in this world, and our job is to root out evil and then how they impact people. But it's crazy to attack an entire religion and target all those people.
I agree with that. My question, Wajahat, for you is what does the Muslim community do to root out these extremists in their midst?
Right.
Well, okay, I'm going to flip it
understanding.
No.
By the way, everything you said, any white person who's committed such an atrocity should obviously go to jail for the rest of their life.
What has Jillian done to root out white mass shooters in America? Jillian, what have you done to root out and de-radicalize the white men in your community who are responsible for the #1 mass shooting in this country?
I would condemn and call it out, and I would, if I was on a jury, I would absolutely
what have you done?
vote for them to go to prison. I'm also
and
not
that
doing
is the
anything
to
go after radical Muslims.
Piers,
I'm trying
Piers, the
to
question,
condemn
Piers,
all violence and form like some common ground with you here, where radicalism across the board should be condemned. But I think what you're not understanding is when people are concerned, they're concerned, as far as I can tell, about assimilation. And in all the conversations that I have had about this, they are worried, like, hey, if it's 2 radical Muslims and 1 good guy, how are we going to keep the 2 radicals out? And if you've got, let's say, 1% of 2 billion people that want to bring down the West, like, what do you do about chance of death to America and Dearborn? Like, this is what I'm saying. Like, what do you say about
I keep hearing
that?
assimilation. Piers, I keep hearing assimilation. And again, this is the point which you're making. You keep saying assimilation, that is the answer. Again, what happens when people who are born here, who were brought here in chains, and their ancestors and their folks are here, and you still are dealing with white domestic terrorism? Is that assimilation? See, this is the problem. Y'all somehow think that assimilation, that's going to be the answer. That's not. It is not the answer.
Well,
and so it's nonsensical to think so.
Well, depends what you mean. I mean, look, let me
thrive in America.
Yeah, let them define assimilation.
Let me bring in Cenk here.
I'll define
Let me bring in Cenk.
I'll define it. It's not chanting death to America. It's loving America.
Hang on,
wanting
Jillian.
to pursue the
It's
American
also not
dream.
participating in a violent insurrection.
That's kind of the answer,
All right.
in my opinion.
Can I say something, please, to Cenk? So, Cenk, this word assimilation, what it really means to me, at its purest, is that if you come to, say, the United States or the UK or Australia from another country, particularly another country which has a very different culture. So say you come from the Middle East and you come to live in America, live in London, live in Sydney, whatever. The word assimilate means that you do your best to be part of the new culture you're joining. What you don't do is put a drawbridge up and start your own culture within the culture of the country you go to at the expense of that nation's culture. I mean, at its purest...
That's not true!
Well, that is true.
Okay, if what you just described is the case, then the Italians, the Jewish, the Polish, every group that came to the United States did exactly what you just said. They had own communities, own culture. So, do y'all understand the history of America?
Yes, and I also understand that in the
and what you described.
Well, I don't remember the Italians in America setting up their own rival court system, for example, unless I missed it.
Muslims haven't either.
Did they?
Yeah, no.
Because in the UK, we now have nearly 100 Sharia courts have been set up. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't remember that happening with any of the Poles or the Italians in the United States. That's what I'm talking about, Cenk.
Okay. All right. So what I can't stand is the double standard. So if, for example, Jillian said, what if 10% Muslims are violent? Okay. If you said that about Jewish people and you said, look, I'm not worried about most Jews, but, if 10% of Jews are treacherous and serve Israel first and betray their country. Hold on. No, Jillian. Now you let me talk.
Gaza?
Okay? No, you let me talk. No. Okay. So now, if you said 10% of Jews are the real problem, everyone would be outraged, and rightfully so. That's not the right thing to say. But people say it blithely about Muslims, like we don't count, and it's no big deal to discriminate against us. Now let's talk about immigration. You fill out forms. If some idiot fills out a form and says, I'm for ISIS, I'm for Muslim extremism, and you don't want to let him into the country, of course you don't let him into the country. But now we're talking about Muslims at large. Wait, that's a totally different thing. By the way, are we doing the same thing for Israelis? Are we having them fill it? Hold on. Are we asking them to fill out a form? Are you against murdering 20,000 Palestinian kids? And if they say, no, I am for it, and I like what Israel did, are we banning them because they're sick, violent extremists who don't mind the murder of 20,000 children? No, of course not. In fact, when you look at the forms right now, what we're asking in entering our country is, what are your views about Israel? Who gives a damn what their views about Israel are when they're coming to America? Why are we asking about a different country? What I care most about is American sovereignty. Now, Roland is right. Muslims come here, Jews come here, Italians, etc. We all assimilate to some degree. I love the Pittsburgh Steelers. My favorite food is subs, etc. And I'm sure that's true of Jews, Christians, everyone, right? But we also keep a part of our culture. And if we said to, again, Jewish people, like we're saying to Muslims, how dare you not assimilate? What's with the silly hat and the stupid little things and the things coming out of your pockets? Why don't you assimilate? The real problem is the Jews. And they're too, hold on. And they're too loyal to Israel. And that's the real problem. They will not assimilate. All they care about is Israel. Everyone would say you're an unacceptable anti-Semite and you should be canceled forever.
Listen,
I've got to... People say it about Muslims,
okay, listen,
I've got to...
There's something incredibly satisfying about watching Roland Martin completely unravel Jillian Michaels' argument on Piers Morgan's show, not because it's a gotcha moment, but because it's so rare to witness someone dismantle fear with actual facts and a sense of history. This exchange is more than a debate, it's a masterclass in showing how fear-driven rhetoric falls apart when faced with evidence and moral clarity. Jillian enters the conversation with a seemingly rehearsed script, akin to the kind of talking points you'll hear echoed in certain media outlets. She presents herself as the bold truth-teller, willing to bring up uncomfortable issues about radical Islam and extremism that she claims others are too afraid to discuss. It's a familiar act, masked as concern and branded as daring honesty, but Roland quickly sees through it and opts not to play along. Instead of going on the defensive, he challenges the premise of her argument. When Roland references his recent visit to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which highlights the 4,400 lynchings that have occurred, he isn't going off on a tangent. He's setting the context that Jillian is trying to steer clear of. By acknowledging America's well-documented history of majority-driven religious and racial violence, the narrative that Muslims are a singular threat starts to crumble. Roland's essentially saying, I know what it's like when an entire community is targeted. I'm not here to let history repeat itself. His mention of FBI Director Christopher Wray's warning about the danger of white domestic terrorism is a strategic masterstroke. This isn't coming from a progressive think tank, it's the FBI under a Republican administration relaying the facts. When Roland shifts to discuss Senator Tommy Tuberville's comments about eliminating Muslims by asking, what about white Christians? Given their statistical link to mass shootings, he's highlighting an inconvenient truth. To have genuine discussions on religious extremism and violence, honesty about the sources of these threats is crucial, as confirmed by law enforcement. Jillian's interruption attempt speaks volumes about her discomfort with Roland's dismantling of her points. She doesn't want to let him reach his conclusion. Roland maintains his stance, pointing out that as an African-American Christian, he knows the history of white Christian violence. He's not saying that Christianity or white people are inherently violent. He's arguing against generalizing the actions of a few to an entire group. Consistent standards should apply to all communities. Roland's effectiveness stems from his grounding in data and historical trends, in contrast to Jillian's fear-based approach. While she talks about percentages of radical Muslims as a threat assessment, he counters with what federal law enforcement says about domestic terrorism. She tries to create an air of suspicion around Muslims, but Roland reminds everyone that this tactic has a devastating precedent in American history. Roland's point about gun violence and Australia's response is especially incisive. Australia enacted strict gun laws after a mass shooting and saw a significant reduction in gun deaths. The US, despite frequent mass shootings, refuses similar action. If safety is truly the goal, why focus on a lesser threat while ignoring a more pressing issue? Roland implies the answer. It's about which communities are targeted as scapegoats and which problems are tackled. When Piers Morgan comments on assimilation and immigrants forming their own communities, Roland's response is simply devastating. He names groups like Italians, Jews, and Poles, who all did exactly the same, formed ethnic neighborhoods, kept their languages, continued cultural traditions. This isn't a failure of American society, it's its fabric. The notion that Muslims are failing to assimilate is historically unfounded, and Roland brilliantly exposes that fallacy. In just about 15 seconds, it's remarkable how Roland manages to blend passion with precision during this discussion. He's visibly frustrated, asking several times to complete his argument, yet he maintains control over his discourse. He avoids personal attacks or emotional outbursts, and instead, he consistently presents facts, historical perspective, and logical arguments. Meanwhile, Jillian continually tries to cut him off, redirect the conversation, or return to her pre-scripted points about Muslim extremism. But Roland firmly steers the dialogue away from that fear-driven narrative. Moreover, the way Roland represents himself in this conversation is crucial. By repeatedly stating he's an African-American Christian, he establishes his own religious identity. This clarity indicates he's not defending Islam due to personal belief in it, but connects his perspective to the Black American struggle against collective blame and discrimination. He illustrates that defending Muslims from collective judgment isn't about political correctness, but about recognizing patterns of injustice that any minority in America would find familiar and troubling. What really distinguishes this moment is Roland's moral clarity, which elevates it beyond typical debates on cable news. Jillian attempts to rationalize broad suspicion and amplify collective wariness towards Muslims as being pragmatic about threats. Roland flatly rejects this premise, advocating for a universally clear standard judge individuals based on their actions, not their faith. Identify and address evil regardless of appearance or belief. Avoid condemning entire communities for the misdeeds of a few. These principles echo the foundational ideals of justice in America, and Roland isn't just advocating for Muslims, he's defending a principle that safeguards everyone. Accepting collective blame for one group can easily lead to it being applied to any group. Roland, drawing from historical lessons, knows this well. African Americans have faced collective blame for crime, despite being frequent victims of both crime and biased policing. Japanese Americans were unjustly interned during World War II due to collective suspicion. Irish Catholics were once seen as cultural threats to America. The cycle perpetuates because people buy into the myth that this time it's different, and label a particular group as genuinely dangerous. Jillian doesn't engage with Roland's substantial arguments because she lacks the means. How can one dismiss FBI statistics or documented historical trends? How does one argue that Muslims deserve collective suspicion, yet ignore how mass shootings by predominantly white men shouldn't implicate all white people or Christians? The inherent contradiction is unresolvable, so she attempts to speak over him, or to return to her initial talking points. By the end of Roland's discourse, he achieves what is rare in televised debates, a transformation of the narrative. What began as Jillian's effort to discuss the Muslim threat shifts into a conversation about intellectual integrity, equal standards, and America's true history with violence. He turns the defensive need to justify why Muslims shouldn't be viewed suspiciously into an offensive stance against proponents of collective blame of any group. The interaction underscores a component often absent from such discussions: the critical importance of coming equipped with detailed information. Roland refrains from vague statements, opting instead for precise references. He mentions institutions like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, names the FBI director directly, recalls Senator Tommy Tuberville's actual remarks, and notes Australia's specific policy on gun violence. This specificity fortifies his argument, making it tough to ignore or sidestep. You can't easily dismiss documented evidence and named resources as you can with broad claims concerning threats and statistics. Roland comprehends, and this understanding amplifies his response, that conversations about Muslims and extremism often miss the mark if presumed to be about safety. They're really about whether we maintain principles of justice consistently or establish hierarchies dictating who is deemed worthy of individual assessment and who suffers collective blame. He rejects that hierarchy outright, revealing the intellectual and moral void in its framework. Roland also brings practical insight to his approach. He recognizes that acknowledging the topic of potential radicalization among Muslims already concedes the point, as it embraces a flawed framing.